Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's getting closer to 2026. And as we get to 2026, well, we're looking at the news, also looking backwards whilst looking forwards. But before we get on to the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. So let's start off with the first news article, and that is that South Africa is now paying the highest tax burden in democratic history. Our tax to GDP ratio now sits at 25.1%. which is amongst the highest in the developing world. Now, government relies on a small overtaxed base rather than economic growth. We haven't really had economic growth for some time. And Treasury admits that sustainability is a problem, but still refuses structural reforms. Remember the numerous structural reforms that could occur in South Africa, such as the scrapping of BE and so forth. That means that effectively, we could have economic growth. Now, VAT hikes have been politically blocked, so government has turned instead to fuel levies and bracket creep. Now, the middle-class households in South Africa are being squeezed while state inefficiencies continue to decline. Now, all this at a time where South Africa's relationship with the United States has deteriorated sharply. Now, the reason for that you'll already know. As you know, the US imposed 30% tariffs and boycotted the G20 summit in Johannesburg, but now the Deputy Trade Minister has admitted that South Africa cannot afford this fallout. But they admit that the damage is already done. Now, the reason for this was ideological, and unfortunately, in this instance, the ANC's ideology has replaced pragmatic diplomacy, because as we know in South Africa, ideology always wins out. Now, the government is trying to scramble to diversify trade, not out of strategy, but out of desperation. Because as we've already seen, South Africa is overtaxed, and obviously we're not growing economically. Now, the government has a way that they think they're somehow going to create economic growth whilst also improving employment in the previously disadvantaged sector. And if you already know, you know, but that is that the government wants to introduce a 100 billion rand transformation fund. Now, even insiders in the ANC admit that this is built to fail. They're going to fail BEE, and it's going to become another elite enrichment system and not an empowerment system. The ANC itself admits that. And yet they want to go ahead with this for, well, looting purposes, I can only but assume. Now, the structural bottlenecks that we actually see in South Africa that stops the previously disadvantaged while economically progressing are very obvious to most people to see. Electricity, logistics, permits, water. Many of these will remain unresolved whilst we're going to have this transformation fund. So what we're effectively doing is throwing money at structural issues rather than actually fixing the fundamentals. This is how the South African government seems to operate at the moment. Now, while South Africa's relationship continues to degrade, South Africa continues to deepen engagement with Moscow, this despite backing a UN resolution against China. Now, as you know, South Africa claims that it's neutral on paper, although it is very aligned in practice, and to massage this contradiction, deputy ministers attended a Russian-Africa partnership talk. Now, South Africa increasingly has positioned itself within authoritarian-aligned multipolar blocs. Now, this shift is going to have real consequences for trade, investment, and credibility going forward. Now, there's many of you that don't really understand what the idea behind a multipolar world is. And that is, and I'm going to summarize it for you very easily and very quickly. The first is that there's this idea that after World War II, the world's superpower, the world's most advanced economy, the one and only country there was in the world that basically steered all humanity was the US, and nobody could challenge its economic and military power. But that is no longer the case, because with the ascendancy of China and with the ascendancy of India, and to a degree Russia, although not really Russia, what we are finding is that there are now power blocks. Now, in the traditional context, what these power blocks would do is they go to war, and then obviously the dominant one would win out. But a war with these type of power blocks would mean, well, probably the end of humanity and the destruction of the planet. So instead, they talk about the multipolar world, with numerous power blocks with individuals aligning themselves to a power block. So if an individual wants to align themselves to the China power block, they would align themselves to that. And if they wanted to align themselves with the Western or the American power block, they'd do that. And it is that multipolar world idea that the South African government is aligning itself to. Now, in other news, the government has actually proposed sweeping changes to its asylum and immigration laws. This after, obviously, all the Palestinian flights that came into South Africa. Now, they are going to introduce what they consider to be a first safe country rule to block asylum abuse. Now, if you watch the Palestinian flights that came to South Africa, they actually stopped off in Nairobi and then flew to South Africa. So that would have effectively been the first safe country rule. Now, this is meant to mirror what goes on in Europe. The idea means that when they go to Europe, they're given asylum in the first safe country, which should stop them from going to other countries like Britain. But it doesn't actually work. So will it actually happen in reality in South Africa? I don't know. This is the same time that the South African government wants to shift to a merit-based citizenship and digital population control method. What this effectively means is that they're admitting that the admission into the system, the admission into South Africa has been abused for years. And what we actually have is we have citizenship in South Africa that doesn't really make sense. Well, now they're saying they want citizenship through merit, that basically they want the best and brightest to come to South Africa. So the question is this going to be a credible enforcement method or just another policy document that the ANC tries to put in place to somehow suggest that they're doing something positive? You can let me know what you think in the comment section below. Now, for those of you who watched my initial video around the South African slaves that were sold to the Russian military service, well, this is a follow-on from that story. As you know, 17 South African men were allegedly lured into the Russian military services with promises of training or work. Instead, they were actually sent to the front lines in Donetsk. Now, they've described living in freezing conditions. They've been described as being forced to do labor and being in constant danger, with their families having been abandoned over Christmas with no information about them. Now, the allegations point to political networks and intermediaries, and if you watch my videos, you'll know that one of the political networks highly fingered in this is the MK party. Well, in a new twist in the story, Russian contractors have now alleged a demand for money for the release of these individuals, and this is obviously after the government petitioned Russia to return these individuals. Now, according to the news, these Russian contractors said, "We will if you pay money for their release." Now, the South African government has refused to pay what it considers to be a ransom. One man is already severely injured and all their lives are currently at risk. So let's go back a few steps and we can remind ourselves that South Africa continues to align with Russia while saying that Russia is effectively ransoming their own citizens of the state. So what can we actually take from the story? Well, what we can take from the story is that the ANC lacks any form of morals. Whilst our citizens are trapped in war zones, politicians fight guns as celebration. And this is the news that one of the deputy mayors was filmed discharging a weapon in public. In fact, you can have a watch of that right here. Now, this deputy mayor actually comes from the Western Cape. Now, the claims were from this individual that the gun itself was symbolic or a toy, and police are still investigating. Now, this in itself is important to understand because we know of an instance where a firearm was fired in the public before, was Julius Malema. And the defense that Julius gave at the time was that actually the firearm was fake, it was a toy. Can you see how this is all kind of coming full circle? Now, this specific deputy mayor is part of the IMP, which is a small regional party, not actually part of the ANC or the DA. but she does serve in a local coalition arrangement with the DA. Now, gun safety organizations have condemned the act as reckless and unlawful, and to be frank, I don't care about gun safety organizations. They can all go to hell. So Gun-Free South Africa, if you're watching, do one. In any case, children were present at the incident, and actually firing of the firearm was unsafe. But what we can really take from this is that the DA was very quick to jump on the bandwagon around Julius Malema firing an assault rifle at his own events. So they wanted him prosecuted to the utmost extent of the law. The DA now must apply the same standards to members of its own coalition. You cannot have rules for citizens and excuses for officials. In any case, ladies and gentlemen, that's the news of today. What we're actually seeing in South Africa is, yet again, high taxes, weak services, and ideological economies. We're seeing all sorts of rubbish play out, with the political elite acting with impunity at home. And what we're really seeing is systematic decay in the republic. But that's just my views. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And until next time, bye.